excuse me. So this is what the association, just to remind ourselves what the association is here for. It's to engage, equip, and empower Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the Vineyard movement. And these are the three goals. And I think these are just tremendous goals, really that meets the moment for what it's meant to be Asian American and Pacific Islander over the past few years. And I think it also honors our community holistically. It honors our past, and it really focuses on creating a path for our community to realize, the fullness of our identity in Christ by recognizing the meaningfulness of our ethnic and racial identity as part of our reflection, of the image of God. So this is my daughter. I thought I'd just, start a little bit about myself here. And she's 6 years old. She's going to be in first grade next year. And quite frankly, she's the reason why I know there's a God, because no mortal could put that much drama inside such a little body. But I couldn't be luckier to have a daughter like Ellie. We live in New Jersey. We're just across the Hudson River from New York City. And recently we were coming back from New York City, and we usually take the George Washington Bridge to go back and forth, but we were running a little bit late coming back, and our GPS was telling us that the Lincoln Tunnel would be about 10 minutes faster. So this was actually Ellie's first time going through the Lincoln Tunnel. And for some reason, she was a little bit apprehensive and wasn't sure why we just couldn't go on the George Washington like we normally do. And so to reassure her in all my wisdom as a father, I explained to her that this Lincoln Tunnel was a tunnel that Elf walked through to get to New York City after he passed through the 7 levels of the candy cane forest and through the sea of swirly, twirly gumdrops. And after she realized the significance of the Lincoln Tunnel, she suddenly became very excited about going through it. And now she feels sort of a different connection to Elf and the Lincoln Tunnel. And I realize it's somewhat of a questionable parenting decision to allow a 6-year-old to be familiar with the movie Elf, but we can sort of table that possibly for Q&A. But all that to say, as we go through this together as a community, my hope, our hope, I think I can speak on behalf of folks in the leadership team, is that we can grow and learn and share in a way that makes our broader AAPI's community journey through history more meaningful and relevant to us, whether it's in how we do ministry, how we interact as a community, or otherwise. So we'll sort of start talking through history, and as Dennis and I sort of spoke about what will we cover here, this really was sort of the goal was to be kind of foundational and sort of kind of walk through basic sort of history and Christian identity and the like. And so I just want to frame the fact that when we think about history, right, when we think about things of this nature, we need to consider this in multiple lenses simultaneously. I think oftentimes as we sort of consume these things, we tend to sort of look at them through a single lens at a time. But history is obviously very nuanced and complex. And so when we think about AAPI history, immigration policy is core to that. Foreign policy is highly influential. Theology, race relations and racial climate, and the political climate, right? So obviously we don't have a ton of time here. For the sake of time, I'm just going to address these things in very general terms. I'll make sort of simplified statements, but obviously when we're talking about these things, they're all nuanced and they're all complicated. And I'm happy to have sort of further discussions on any of these things, because they are indeed not quite as simple as I'll sort of state them out for given our constraints here. So I think before we sort of move into the actual history itself, I think it's useful to sort of talk about what is Asian American, AAPI, APA. Fundamentally, Asian American is a political term. It was coined in the civil rights era. There are various attributions of this, but generally speaking, it's attributed to a person, an individual by the name of Yuji Chioka, who was the professor at UCLA who taught the first ethnic studies class there, and his partner Emma Gee, who was a student activist at UC Berkeley. And really, the term Asian American was created as a rejection of the term Oriental. And it was the first attempt to create some level of Pan-Asian identity. And obviously it's imperfect, it's an imperfect term, and it's often messy because really as a political term, it involves the amalgamation of many diverse ethnicities and cultures, really for the sake of or for the goal of classification, power, community, etc. The terms AAPI Asian American Pacific Islander, API Asian Pacific Islander, APA Asian Pacific American, we've seen these terms sort of evolve and kind of come in and out over time. And these were terms that were created specifically to recognize and include people whose origins are from the Pacific Islands. Now, despite that, the Pacific Islander cohort, they have very different histories and needs. And this is the area where, it's never been, we're just simply not clean, right? So if you're looking at the Pacific Islander populations, they've experienced land displacement and dislocation in ways that the broader Asian American community hasn't. And so that sort of made, some messiness in that classification. And, so in 1990, the US Census Bureau created the category Asian or Pacific Islander. But subsequent to that, there was actually, some significant backlash to that by the Pacific Islander community to being lumped in. So beginning in 2020, that group has actually been separated out and they're dealt with separately. And, I was speaking with Sabrina Chan, who runs the Asian American ministry at IV. They are very specifically Asian American at IV because the Pacific Islander cohort has, deliberately chose to associate with the native ministries over at IV because they feel like there are more commonalities with native ministries, specifically because of issues like land displacement and dislocation. So again, these things are fluid and a little bit messy, but this is where that term really comes from. And here at the Vineyard, we've chosen to be the AAPI Association in order to be intentionally and officially inclusive. So that's where, certainly at this point we're where we are. Now, to do a very, very quick, unfairly quick, I would characterize overview of AAPI history. Asian Americans have been in the US since the 16th century, right, with the first Filipinos arriving in Morro Bay. And in fact, if you go to Morro Bay, there's actually a plaque, a metal plaque. Morro Bay is, I think, well known for its smokestacks, but there's this plaque at the site where it's believed that the first Filipinos arrived. And many of the Asian Americans that came to this country early on were for labor, right? They came with the gold rush, they came to build the railroads. But very early on, there was a very strong exclusionist, anti-Asian sentiment that pervaded, right? And there were lynchings, there were various acts of hatred, but one of the more sort of clear, objective manifestations of this anti-Asian, this exclusionist sentiment was in the legislative agenda, right? So throughout the late 19th century, you had various legislative acts that were designed to exclude or oppress Asian Asians that were in this country, most specifically Chinese. So in 1870, you had the Naturalization Act, which essentially prohibited Chinese Americans from naturalization. In 1875, there was the Page Act, prohibiting the entry of Chinese women. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a 10-year act that prohibited all immigration of Chinese. And then the Geary Act followed that in 1892, and it essentially extended the Chinese Exclusion Act by adding sort of a host of onerous regulations. You had the annexation of Hawaii, and then in the early 20th century, interracial marriage between Asians and whites was prohibited in California. California passed the Alien Land Act, which essentially banned non-citizens from being able to own or lease land, which many Asian Americans at that time circumvented by putting the land in the name of their U.S.-born children and the like. And then in 1924, they passed the Exclusionary Immigration Act, which really essentially, by virtue of its structure, massively tamped down immigration volumes. by national origin, essentially almost entirely shut off Asians from immigrating to the U.S. And then, on came World War II and obviously the Japanese internment. And so, I've stopped this timeline at 1965 because this sort of transition from pre to post World War II in 1965 is what I believe is sort of worth us perhaps at this point kind of just sitting on for a little while. So post World War II, the US entered a position of global leadership. And as part of that global leadership, they really attempted to assert moral leadership as well. And there's a lot of just general sort of backlash because the enemies of the United States would basically say, look, like the US is racist country, who are they to tell you how you should be existing and things of that nature. And so in a sense, this foreign policy initiative of the US in terms of trying to attain or sort of attain sort of global leadership drove these efforts domestically to attempt to deal with discrimination of minorities and really sort of in some sense facilitated the civil rights era. And part of that narrative was a public relations campaign on behalf of Asian Americans, where there was a shift from the yellow peril sort of model to the sort of model minority. They were held up as really examples of what immigration can give, the opportunities that the U.S. provides for immigrants. And so 1965 is pivotal because that was when the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, was passed. And that act essentially changed how immigration worked in this country and essentially opened it up and took away all the sort of the discrimination based on national origin. Obviously, there have been numerous notable points in time in Asian American history post 1965, be it the murder of Vincent Chin or Norman Mineta being appointed the first U.S. cabinet member, Asian American cabinet member. I know John wants us to mention insanity, so I'll mention insanity, but things like that. But I think it's important that we sort of sit on 1965 for a particular reason, and that is because this change in immigration policy completely altered the makeup of the racial makeup of this country, and completely changed the makeup of even the AAPI population. So prior to 1965, and I got a couple exhibits here from AAPI data. So if anybody's interested, this AAPI data has excellent sources of information on the AAPI population, was heavily dominated by immigration from European countries. And as you can see, the suppression of Asian American immigration here. But this was arguably one of the most critical events for our history in this country. It essentially reversed systematic exclusion. And it was an outgrowth of US foreign policy, as I mentioned previously. And really, what you see here is that this act essentially changed immigration from being something that came from Europe to essentially migrations from Asia in the West, and Latin America from the South. And we see that today. And this act really was monumental, sort of. And I would imagine if many of us can probably point to this act as being the reason why our parents came and why we're here today. I know, my father was able to bring brothers and 4 brothers and a sister here. He brought his parents here for a time, and this is all a result of this particular act. There were 3 priorities in the Immigration Nationality Act, or the Hart-Celler Act. The first one was family reunification, which accounts for approximately 75% of the immigrants that are brought in under this law. About 20% of it is skills-based, right? And so I think we're pretty familiar with both those areas. And there's a small, about 5 percentage points related to refugee admission into this country. But that's the basis. And for the Asian American population, it ended the only period of predominantly US born AAPI. So in the US from about the 1940s to 1970s, the Asian American population in this country was predominantly US born. After about beginning sort of the late 70s into the 80s, the Asian American population became predominantly foreign born, has remained so since, and is anticipated to remain predominantly foreign born for the foreseeable future. And this Hart-Celler Act to this day remains foundational to immigration policy. And again, we've talked about this before. Many of our parents, relatives, brothers, sisters, uncles, grandparents, all came, under this act. Additionally, this act had dramatically remade the Asian American population in this country. If you look at that 1965 point wherein that the Hart-Celler Act was created, the Japanese Americans were the largest cohort of Asian Americans, pre-Hart-Cellers. And essentially Chinese and Filipinos made up the balance, kind of evenly split the balance. After that, the population shifted dramatically to other Asian American communities, in particular towards South Asians and Southeast Asians. So not only did it dramatically increase, the number of Asian Americans, it shifted it to being predominantly foreign born, and it shifted it away from Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans and the like to become a dramatically more diverse population. So, as we look slightly more into this, what was this exclusionist period like, right? And so we often hear when we hear about the exclusionist period, the sort of yellow peril and the like, but the reality is the predominant narrative of Asians was that of heathen, right? And it was actually a Christian context that characterized Asians in this country. The basis in the language is Christian. Heathen was used in the sort of traditional biblical sense as being those who were not believers, right? Those who were not saved. And Asian immigrants were characterized as a threat to Christianity and to America, right? Reverend O.C. Wheeler, Oswald Wheeler, who was a well-known Baptist minister, who was a missionary to California. He said, we must Christianize the Chinese or be heathenized by them. And in fact, as Asian Americans were converted, they were classified as either being saved or being heathen. And that was really the language that was used around Asian Americans. O.C. Wheeler, he gave an address at California State Capitol. If anyone's interested, I actually have the full transcript of the speech. And he says lots of interesting things. I'll just sort of share one quote here from that speech, but it was apparently a very well attended. The whole house was packed at the California State Capitol. And he said, the Chinese are more poisonous to a pure Christianity, more threatening to the life of the American Republic than all other evil influences that have ever brooded over our land. I believe, as I believe in the existence of God, my maker, that unless the immigration of the Chinese shall be virtually suppressed, they will, sooner or later, permeate every portion of our whole country, undermine and control every profitable industry, subvert and destroy all our free institutions, replace our sanctuaries with the temples of idolatry, and transform our land into the generator and hotbed of every foul and unclean thing. So, the sort of the use of or the sort of the Christian justification for this view, was prevalent, and it's similar to the slave owner using biblical justification for owning slaves. It sort of has roots in the doctrine of discovery, which subsequently evolved into manifest destiny, which subsequently evolved into American exceptionalism and the like. And we can that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But the theological or the Christian language that was used to justify this anti-Asian sentiment was very common back then. Now, the exclusionists were the predominant group, and again, to try to be sort of slightly more nuanced about it, there were there were a couple other groups here. There were conversionists who were slightly were a smaller group, but this group emphasized conversion, compassion, racial equality, and these were really predominantly represented by the mainline Protestant denominations, right? The Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and they funded missionaries. They funded ethnic churches in ethnic neighborhoods. And the emphasis that they had was really more on building the kingdom, right? They were less concerned about soteriology and eschatology and the atonement and things like that, but they're really concerned about how do we meet the needs the way Christ did, for these communities. And it was sort of the early rise of the social gospel. And then the third and really very, very small group of the pluralists, there were a group of people who believed in racial democracy, right? Who believed in religious and cultural pluralism and the like. But it's really that conversionist group that I want to focus on now as we sort of go into this. And really, again, it was these mainline denominations, right? They funded these efforts. They built many of the churches for these Asian ethnic communities, and they began ministering to their social needs and advocating for the community, right? So if you see, there are artifacts still of these churches. If you look at the United Methodist Chinese Church, these are artifacts of these mainline churches that were started well over 100 years ago. These mainline churches, they sent missionaries to the internment camps, to Japanese internment camps, and they worshiped and they did worship services across denominational lines, right? So this is where there was much less emphasis on ideology and much more emphasis on how do we bring the kingdom here on earth. And this was very much sort of that vein here that existed. So by the 1930s, right, you had the emergence of a very vibrant English-speaking second generation of Asian Americans, right? These immigrants that had come sort of in the late 19th century, had their own kids, their kids were starting to grow up, and they were ready to lead their own churches. And so that led to really that first cohort of Asian American Christians who were rising up and wanting to take leadership in the churches and wanting to understand, Christian identity. And so you had the birth of things like the Lake Tahoe Conference in the 1930s and CONFAB, or the National Conference of Chinese American Churches, that emerged in the 50s. And there was a strong identification with Protestantism among Asian Americans in organizations such as the Chinese and Japanese YMCAs and YWCAs and things of that nature. And really, Asian Americans at that point in time, in the 1920s to the 1940s, they talked a lot about what it would mean, in these ethnic churches, in the Chinese American church. What would it mean for us to get involved in social justice issues in Chinatown? What would it mean for us to meet the needs of a community that struggled with food and housing and things of that nature? So that was very much the DNA of the early Asian American church. And again, as time went through and we sort of entered the civil rights era, right? Asian American mainline Protestants were very energized during the civil rights era. And they were active participants in the Third World Liberation Front. They were active proponents of ethnic studies, things of that nature, trying to figure out how to build Asian American institutions to overcome injustices and provide for the needs of their community. They were less interested in assimilation, and they were more interested in how do we build up our community? How do we care for our communities? How do we meet their needs? And it was guys like Alan Wong, Lloyd Wake, Harry Chuck, Roy Sano, folks who really sort of asserted sort of the importance of representing and advocating for Asian Americans in the broader society. And so we end up at a point here where we sort of get to the post 1970 era of Asian American Christianity. And these are my words, right? In my opinion, sort of that post, right as we sort of cross over from 1970, that is the first golden age of Asian American Christianity, right? You began to see caucuses within denominations be built across ethnic lines, right? You saw support for Asian American denominational hires. You saw the development of Asian American church curriculum, and you saw the birth of Asian American feminism and the elevation of Christian women voices in the church, right? And so Pan-Asian ethnic identity was emerging and had a foothold. And Asian American identity and Asian American stories really had their moment here post 1970. And this was a population that was still very heavily influenced by mainline denominations and by the social gospel, right? The emphasis among many of these Asian American congregations and Asian American Christians was the emphasis on creating a more Christian, a more moral, and a more just society. It was less on sort of the ideological, underpinnings and things of that nature. And there was a real heavy emphasis on community activism and support, right? So Vincent Chin, the murder of Vincent Chin, for those who are unfamiliar, he was a Chinese American who was out celebrating his bachelor party in Detroit, and there were a couple white auto industry employees who've been recently laid off. They basically projected their dissatisfaction and belief that the Japanese auto industry was the reason why they lost their jobs, and they murdered him. The response to that from a local organizing effort was actually led by Reverend Norman Wong, right? And so the church was very, very involved in advocacy and community support. The Wesley Wu founded the Ecumenical Working Group of Asia Pacific Americans. And this was a group that was designed and built specifically to fight anti-Asian hate. And there was a strong vein of community preservation and empowerment. And so we'll just sort of roll through these next slides pretty quickly. But like before there was Stop AAPI Hate, there was the Ecumenical Working Group of Asia Pacific Americans. And so they were publishing materials for folks on how do you respond to Asian American hatred, elevating Asian American incidents of Asian American hate and things of that nature. UGAPA was publishing these regular newsletters talking about Asian American issues within the Christian community. You had organizations like JSAC, which is a Joint Strategy and Action Committee, publishing newsletters. Mainline church leaders looked to their denominations and seminaries, and there are all these nonprofit organizations that were working to increase sort of pan-ethnic understanding. They had identified a need for Asian American leadership development, representation on boards, resources for Asian American ministries, and so a lot of that was sort of occurring in this sort of post-1970 period. Third World Women was an organization that appeared during this time as well. And here they elevated the voices of Asian American women, Asian American Christian women. And it's kind of interesting, as these Asian American women voices in the church were being elevated, there's this general sort of, I think realization is the wrong word, but realization that not only were they fighting white racism, but they were also fighting Asian male sexism as well. And so this is just a very sort of pivotal time in the recognition of Asian American voices. These Bible studies, Roy Sano, Wesley Wu, guys like that, these ethnic resources for Asian Americans. And these are Bible studies that were created for elementary school kids. In fact, I remember seeing the one on the right in my pastor's house as a very, very, very young child. And so this was a very sort of robust period for Asian Americans. So the question is, what happened, right? Because I think certainly for me, I can't speak for others, but it feels like almost a distant memory. Certainly that's not the context, that I felt like I grew up in as an Asian American Christian. Well, really it was precipitated by the decline of mainline denominations, right? Funding dried up. And so as funding dried up, there was less support for ethnic churches. There was less support for ethnic programs. And those things, those Bible studies, those newsletters, all those things, started to essentially dry up slightly, right? There was, with the 1965 Immigration Act, this diversification of the population, right? This population grew dramatically. It grew away from, predominantly ethnic Japanese and Chinese American churches. And so that changed the face of the Asian American Christian population. And then the decline of the mainline denominations was also occurred in concert with the ascendancy of the evangelical movement, right? Predominantly in the 1950s. If you look at the 1950s was that period of time where evangelical missionaries essentially became the predominant missionary force overseas, in particular in Asia, and mainline missionaries essentially disappeared. And the evangelical movement really influenced and was influenced by U.S. foreign policy, especially in Korea. Helen Jin Kim, who teaches at the Candler School, wrote a fascinating book recently about evangelicals, South Korea, and U.S. foreign policy. And again, this population that came sort of post 1965, they weren't as aware. They weren't very aware of Asian American history. And in fact, they weren't even sort of the mindset of a Pan-Asian identity. You know, they were very much sort of keeping within their specific ethnic enclaves. And then there was the trans-Pacific transposition, right? So Asian Americans are different than, you know, the Black population and the like, in that you can't look at the Asian American population within the geographic bounds of this country, but you actually have to look at the influence across the Pacific from the native Asian countries. You know, and in particular, this was true for this has been true for the Chinese church, right? The post-communist revolution, you had this influx of Chinese immigrants who came here, and essentially, you know, they look at the American church as sort of this beacon of democracy, this beacon of hope, this bulwark against communism. And, you know, in fact, many of them even came and saw Chinese American churches where, you know, these Chinese American congregations were actively engaging in social justice and advocacy and collaborating with the state to bring resources to their community. And they were like, what are these guys doing? This is why we left China. You know, we left China to get away from this kind of communist stuff. And so this trans-Pacific transposition has been this heavy evangelical influence in Asia for these immigrants that have been coming over. And then these new institutions and structures emerged, right? The emergence of the mega church, right? The emergence of the church growth movement. These things have really sort of diluted the history of you know, the early Asian American Christian church. And so, you know, this is my least favorite slide of the presentation, but I felt like it would be irresponsible not to at least, you know, address this, right? And so, you know, because many of us grew up within the sort of the context of the evangelical movement, right? And that's been the framework that many of us have thought about. The reality is that the evangelical movement has really sort of changed over time and really sort of altered how we think about faith. Now, early on, the evangelical movement, you could define it by the Bebbington Quadrilateral, right? It was an ideological construct, right, where the emphasis was on conversion, right? People need to be saved, you know, activism, right? You need to get out there, you need to evangelize, and biblicism, where you placed importance on the Bible, and then crucicentrism, right, which sort of gave special meaning to Christ's atoning sacrifice, right? That's the Bebbington Quadrilateral. And over time, you know, that's sort of progressively shifted, right? Out of the evangelical movement, this sort of colorblind Christianity, you know, kind of emerged, right? It's these sort of the whole, you know, I don't see color kind of sentiment. That really denied the racial ethnic identity in the name of Christian identity. They almost looked at it as sort of a binary, where the fact that racial and ethnic identity could work against your Christian identity. There are a couple great books. This book, The Myth of Colorblind Christians, if anyone's interested in, this was published late last year. Fantastic book that Jesse Kearns did. It really operates in the black-white binary. There's very little mention of Asian Americans and the like, but it talks very much about what you know, what the evangelical movement's approach has been, you know, to race and the like. And then Divided by Faith is sort of the original seminal work sort of on evangelical movement and race. And that was I think it's about 20 years old now at this point. And then the rise of the moral majority, right, which sort of from like late 1979 through like the early 1990s, and the Christian right, Jerry Falwell, where they sort of engaged in more political activity. And eventually now, as we've seen, as we've become aware, you know, there's a heavy sort of partisan political nature to the evangelical movement that exists today. To the point, let me just back up here, you know, to the point where, you know, if you talk to sociologists today, they actually define, when they say evangelical, right, that definition to them is essentially white male Republican, right? So it's not even as if it's something that, you know, late night talk show hosts like Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah throw around, sociologists actually essentially associate the term evangelical to a white male Republican. So it's sort of, unmoored itself from its original sort of ideological roots. So, and it's become a movement where essentially Christian identity, they create these binaries where Christian identity is above, and it's above the racial and ethnic identity, and racial and ethnic identity has no place in view of Christian identity. It's this idea that evangelism is what's important, not social justice, right? All we need to do is save people. Like if we save people, all the world's ills will be cured. We don't need to engage in social justice because evangelism will solve these problems. And it emphasizes the individual over structures, right? And we see that not just in race, but we see that in other areas, like the gun rights movement, right? So if you think about what happened in Uvalde, sort of post that shooting, there was this really heavy emphasis on, like there's evil in the heart of the gunman, and no real sort of engagement on, hey, what can we do? What can the government do, to ameliorate this problem? So again, it's gone from an ideological concept to a sociological category. Now, that being said, Asian Americans in Christian circles these days has been, there's been a place, right? InterVarsity was the first significant space in evangelical circles where Asian Americans had a voice in racial reconciliation. I have up here the screenshot of this book, Following Jesus Without Dishonoring Your Parents. And I have this up here in particular because, Susan Van Riesen, who is the lead pastor at the Palo Alto Vineyard, was one of the authors of this book and one of the, leaders of the early Asian American ministries over at IV. And so I think it's just important that we honor folks like Susan, who've really been part of building up our community for such a long time. And you see Asian American men leading these historically white Christian institutions, in particular Korean men for some reason, I don't know why. And then you still see lots of first generation Asian American evangelical churches, and you see these new spaces emerging, right? The Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry at Fuller, Center for Asian American Christianity, and the Asian American Christian Collaborative, which emerged in last year. So I think there's a good question as to, why do we do this? Why should we pursue Asian American, anything in this AAPI space? Why is this identity important? It's because history is important, right? Remembering history allows us to take ownership of our place in this society, right? It helps us to understand and grapple with important questions and problems. It helps us to examine how our past has shaped the present, including relationships between people and groups. And it allows us to understand things from a property-centered narrative, right? And it's biblical, right? In Exodus 13, the Israelites were told to commemorate Passover so that they don't forget their history, right? So they don't forget how they got to be where they are. And community is important, right? In the past few years, I know I've spoken to a lot of AAPI folks who felt very alone in this time, right? The work that our community does will always be local, but there's great value in our broader community, right? Our shared experiences, our voices, knowledge, power, coming together, building community is tremendously important. And community, being community-based is a common trait we share. When I spoke with Sabrina Chan, she was talking about how she gathered all the leadership in her Asian American ministries and from various different ethnicities. And they're trying to figure out what common cultural characteristics do we share, across Filipinos and Japanese and Chinese and Indian and Filipino, and they couldn't come up with any except the fact that they're more communal than most other communities. And so it's important that we have community because the Asian American experience is such a high text thing. And really, if the church doesn't do this, where is our community going to go, right? If we don't take up this mantle like we've done historically, where is our community going to go? They'll go to secular places, right? But they should come to us and we should lead. And so why in particular the Vineyard? I would tell you it's because there's a vision here that's meaningful. The Vineyard has a broader vision for stepping into lasting racial reconciliation. And there's a space for us to meaningfully participate in that. There's passion for this, and it exists at the senior levels of the Vineyard movement. It exists in Dennis and each of the members of the core leadership team. And it's why we have 20 some odd people here on a webinar in the middle of a Tuesday. There's commitment from the movement, right? There's an association structure. There's budget that's been allocated. Charles Montgomery, who represents all the associations, has been elevated to super regional leader. There's a seat at the table, right? So the movement is committed. And there's space for us, right? The associations are intended to specifically create space for our community, to have voice, to work with one another, to elevate our community and to bless back into the Vineyard movement at large. And again, we have resources, right? We have budget. We're building networks within the Vineyard and outside of the Vineyard. And we're figuring out how to aggregate content and other resources. And we have a voice. The movement has given us a national platform, right? The movement has given AAPI Voices a national platform. And I think that's no better indicated than the statement here. I've got the screenshot here on the right-hand side. This is the statement that Dennis made, right? That's posted on two places. It's on the main Vineyard USA website and on the Vineyard Justice Network, right? And it's all to serve the kingdom. We're here to serve the kingdom. And at the heart of every person on that core leadership team, I know when we met about a year ago, they all talked about the kingdom first, the kingdom first, the kingdom first. And so we're doing this in the Vineyard to serve the kingdom. And so, I put the link here to the core values. I know you guys can't click on it and get there, but I would encourage all of you just to go back and read the core values of the Vineyard, the 5 core values that were recently sort of republished here. And I think you'll find that it's very natural for us to be doing this within the Vineyard movement. I'm almost done. So this is my son, Colin, here. He's 14 years old. He's going to be a freshman in high school next year. And this is a picture of us last week in Garland, Texas, where he was at a swim meet. Colin's a talented swimmer, ranked somewhere sort of in the top 5 or 6 in the state for his age. We invest a lot in his swimming career and the like. And he also got admitted to our county's magnet high school, which was a competitive process where you had to have an application and letters of recommendation and take a math test and a writing test and do an interview and all these kinds of things. And admissions is sort of in the kind of the low double digits rates. And and my wife and I've always sort of invested in these things, helping him, whether it's swimming or his piano playing or I helped him get ready for this, the whole admissions process, drilling math and essays and practice interviews and things of that nature. And as parents, Asian American parents in particular, we do this to give our kids opportunities, right? And I don't say this to brag about my son or brag, who I am very proud of, or brag about myself, but really to contextualize what it is we're doing on a practical level in our lives, right? What is the point in learning about AAPI history, Christian identity? What is the point of having an AAPI association, right? And for those of us who were at the Northeast Regional Conference last week, David Chow talked about what it means for many of us to parent our kids. And he referenced specifically telling his son on the drive up to work on that next section of the SAT prep. And he characterized this thing that many of us do and our parents did for us. That's our inheritance that we leave for our kids. Because many of us are not beneficiaries of generations of wealth building in this country. So what we leave with our kids with is the best opportunity that we can muster, right? So my question is this the inheritance we should be leaving them? And what is the inheritance that we're leaving? And Dr. Chow, David Chow, in his talk, very deliberately simply called it inheritance, right? And I think there's real value in considering what we're doing here is exactly that in its full meaning, right? What's worth leaving to the next generation, right? Is it a trust fund, a good job, an Ivy League degree, material comfort? As followers of Jesus, I don't think any of those things match our idea of what is worth leaving to the next generation, be it our kids or anybody else. So the question is in our current context and whether, our ethnic or racial identity has a place in that inheritance. And I think the answer to that question is a resounding yes. If we are made in the image of God, the color of our skin and the shape of our eyes cannot be excluded from consideration. And to the extent we've experienced oppression on account of our physical appearance and or our lineage of geographic origin, that is an affront to the image of God in each of us. And if we in turn have repressed consciously or unconsciously our ethnic or racial identity as a result of that, if we have forgone opportunities to be the hands and feet of Christ to the poor, the downtrodden, the otherized, the diminished, those whose experiences by virtue of our ethnic or racial identity we can identify with and or advocate for in ways that others cannot, the fullness of the identity that Christ gave us is also not being realized. So I hope that we can see the AAPI Association be a place where we as a community can come together, we can learn, grow, support one another, and realize the fullness of the life of Christ that comes when our ethnic and racial identity is fully a part of how we serve the kingdom, how we exercise compassion, how we express love in our local communities, how we see, confront, and rectify injustice, how we hear God's voice on behalf of others in our community, how we break down division, how we help our whole Vineyard family engage in the work of reconciliation with one another and the world at large so that we can become all things to see Christ. And I hope that this can be the inheritance that I leave my son Colin. And I hope for my son to realize the fullness of what Christ created him to be, fully inclusive of his ethnic and racial identity. I know that I've lost years, for the lack of appreciating and understanding that God created my racial identity to have value and worth in his kingdom. But as it says in Joel 2:25, I know he'll restore my years, the years that the locusts have eaten. And I believe that can come by leaving my son a full and godly inheritance. So I know that the fullness can come from here, within the Vineyard AAPI Association, and with the work we can do together to engage, empower, and equip one another for the work of the kingdom. So that's it. So thank you for tolerating, and I'll just open it up for discussion or Q&A to folks.